So it's not exactly three separate wars happening to overlap in the news cycle at the same time. It's actually one single, connected threat to global shipping. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because this is one of those episodes where the individual pieces matter less than what they add up to. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, traffic has collapsed by roughly 80%. In the Red Sea, Saudi tankers are going dark, and China has pulled its entire fleet of very large crude carriers out of the region. And in the Black Sea, Russia just sank its first commercial cargo vessel since the start of the war back in early 2022, while a separate strike on the Caspian Sea just connected that war directly to the Iran conflict. Understand that these are not three unrelated news stories that happen to be trending at the same time. These are three fronts of a single, interconnected pressure system bearing down on the entire concept of freedom of the seas. And in my opinion, that concept is losing right now. Before we go further, if you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're alerted when new episodes come out. This is exactly the kind of big picture pattern this channel exists to surface before anyone else connects the dots. And here's something I want you thinking about as we walk through this. Where are you watching this from? And has your country's economy already felt any ripple from rising shipping costs or fuel prices this year? Let me know in the comments, because I don't think most people have connected their own rising costs to what's actually happening on the water right now. Let's take a look at the concept we're actually talking about here, because it matters that you understand where it comes from. Freedom of the seas is a principle that traces back to the early 1600s and the writings of a Dutch jurist named Hugo Grotius. The basic idea is that the open ocean should remain free for navigation and trade for all nations, rather than being controlled or blockaded by any single power. That principle has underpinned global trade for roughly 400 years, and it's the reason a container ship can leave a port in one country and reach a port in another, without needing permission from every nation whose waters it passes near. Understand that this isn't an abstract legal theory. It's the actual operating system that global trade runs on. When that system gets threatened simultaneously in multiple places, the effects don't stay contained to one region. They spread through the entire global economy. Now let's break down each of these three fronts individually first, because you need the full picture of each one before we can talk about how they're connecting. Let's start with the Strait of Hormuz, because this has been building for 21 straight weeks now. Traffic through the strait is down 80%. Over the past week, there was only one inbound very large crude carrier, a VLCC, meaning a tanker capable of hauling roughly 2 million barrels of oil. That came through that route. Dark transits, meaning ships that have disabled their tracking systems specifically to avoid being monitored, now account for 82% of all voyages coming through. Understand what that ratio tells you. It's not that shipping has stopped, it's that the shipping still happening doesn't want to be seen doing it, which tells you operators no longer trust the security environment enough to move openly. The initial disruption back in late February and early March was about war risk and a lack of guaranteed security for transiting vessels. That got addressed relatively quickly at the time. But this newest round of escalation has pushed war risk insurance from around 1% of total ship and cargo value up to somewhere between 7.5% and 9%. That means a single VLCC could be paying up to $10 million just in insurance for one transit. Understand that money alone doesn't stop ships from sailing. That cost simply gets passed down to the consumer. What actually stops ships is the absence of guaranteed safety, because insurance pays for loss, but it doesn't protect a shipowner's crew, reputation, or long-term operations from risks that can't be cleanly priced. At the same time, the U.S. has enforced a blockade posture against Iran, with reporting connected to U.S. Central Command indicating 18 ships have been redirected, 2 fired upon for failing to comply, and 2 others inspected. And yet, despite all of that, Iran has still managed to move an estimated 24 million barrels of oil out of the Persian Gulf, with a significant portion currently sitting off the coast of Malaysia, awaiting ship-to-ship transfer to obscure its origin before re-entering the global market. There's also a brewing secondary issue out of Oman, where reports suggest Iran and Oman may be negotiating new fees for passage through the strait, since the two countries share territorial ownership of that passage. If that materializes into any kind of joint fee authority, that becomes a structural problem entirely separate from the war risk issue, one that persists even if the shooting eventually stops. Now let's move to the Red Sea, because this is the second front, and it connects directly to what's happening in Hormuz through shared shipping infrastructure and shared operators. Houthi forces recently struck two Saudi Arabian tankers, along with Saudi shore facilities. War risk insurance in that region jumped from around 3% up to as high as 75% for vessels connected to Saudi Arabian business specifically. We're seeing Saudi tankers going dark, ships making U-turns before entering the region entirely, and vessels rerouting around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait rather than risking transit. Understand the operational consequence of that. Very large crude carriers cannot transit the Suez Canal fully loaded because their draft is too deep for the canal. So if you're moving oil out of a facility like Yanbu, which produces somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million barrels a day, and you can't send that oil south through the Bab el-Mandeb safely, you're forced into workarounds, routing the entire way around the African continent, using the pipeline system that discharges near Alexandria, or using smaller Suezmax tankers to shuttle oil up to a rendezvous point for a ship-to-ship transfer with a waiting VLCC. Every one of those workarounds adds what the industry calls ton miles, the total distance needed to move a single ton of cargo, and every additional ton mile means more cost passed down the chain. And here's the detail I think is the most telling signal out of this entire front. China has announced it's pulling its VLCCs out of the region entirely. Both COSCO and China Merchants, two of the largest state-linked shipping operators on the planet, have said they will not send vessels back through. That's not a temporary reroute. That's a strategic withdrawal. And it's happening at almost the exact moment Chinese oil demand is beginning to climb again, after a period of reduced consumption that had been quietly keeping global oil prices from spiking harder throughout this entire conflict. When rising demand meets a major buyer's own fleet refusing to operate in the supply region, that's a mismatch waiting to surface. Now let's move to the third front, the Black Sea. And this one has a wrinkle that connects it directly to the other two fronts in a way that I think most coverage has completely missed. Russia has been striking Ukrainian-linked vessels throughout this war, and over just the past month, roughly 28 ships berthed in Ukraine were hit. Ukraine, in response, launched Operation Malka, targeting Russian shuttle tankers, smaller vessels around 7,000 tons each that ferry oil out to larger tankers waiting offshore for ship-to-ship transfer. The exact same workaround mechanism we just described happening in the Red Sea. But something shifted recently. Ukraine widened its targeting beyond those shuttle tankers to commercial vessels operating more broadly in the open Black Sea. On July 26th, a vessel called the Golden Leo off the coast of Ukraine was struck by 3 Russian cruise missiles. The crew abandoned ship, and the vessel ultimately sank. Understand the significance here. This is the first commercial vessel sunk by Russian forces since the very start of the war in early 2022, when a vessel called the Helt went down off Ukraine's coast. 3 years without a single commercial sinking, and now this. And here's the connective tissue between the Black Sea and the Iran conflict specifically. On the same broader timeline, Ukraine struck a vessel believed to be a 90-meter cargo ship called the Anna, along with a Russian patrol vessel on the Caspian Sea, suspected of moving weapons and supplies from Russia into Iran. Understand what that strike represents. The Caspian Sea is landlocked, with no direct connection to the Black Sea or any open ocean. Ukraine reaching that far to hit a supply route feeding material from Russia into Iran means the Russia-Ukraine war and the broader US-Israel-Iran conflict are no longer staying in their separate lanes. They're physically overlapping, on the same water, through the same naval tactics. Now let's step back and look at what all 3 of these fronts share structurally, because this is really the heart of what I want to walk through with you today. In each of these 3 regions, we're seeing the exact same underlying pattern repeat itself. First, an initial military incident or escalation. Second, a spike in war risk insurance that dramatically raises the cost of continued operation in that region. Third, a shift toward dark transits and reduced tracking, as operators try to avoid visibility while still moving cargo. And fourth, a workaround logistics chain involving smaller vessels and ship-to-ship transfers that adds enormous cost and distance to keep goods moving despite the danger. Understand that this same four-part pattern is playing out almost identically in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Black Sea simultaneously, involving completely different belligerents, completely different causes, and completely different international legal frameworks. That's not a coincidence of three unrelated conflicts happening to share a playbook. In my opinion, as someone who's spent years around vessel tracking and maritime logistics, that repeated pattern tells you something important. The underlying vulnerability being exploited in all three cases is the same vulnerability. Global shipping is fundamentally undefended, and any actor willing to accept the diplomatic cost of striking commercial or quasi-commercial vessels can achieve significant strategic leverage with a relatively small number of attacks. Let's talk about the historical parallel here, and I want to be very careful and precise about how I frame this, because I don't want anyone walking away from this video thinking I'm predicting a world war. I am not. But structurally, the pattern we're watching, separate regional conflicts gradually merging and reinforcing each other through shared maritime tactics, echoes conditions historians point to in the lead up to the Second World War. We saw German attacks on Atlantic shipping draw the United States into an undeclared naval war well before formal entry into that conflict. We saw Japanese aggression against European colonial holdings in Southeast Asia, tied to Japan's separate war with China, eventually cascade into a single global conflict. I teach an entire course on the world wars, and we spend considerable time on exactly this kind of pattern: how freedom of the seas issues in supposedly separate theaters gradually become entangled with each other, rather than staying contained. Now, let's talk about why this matters, even if you have no direct connection to shipping, oil, or any of these specific regions. Charter rates for tankers moving fuel out of Yanbu have jumped from around $100,000 per day pre-conflict to new fixtures reportedly reaching $240,000 per day for voyages to Asia. A Black Sea Suezmax tanker is now going for roughly $253,000 per day, about a 25% jump on its own. Crude oil flow out of the Strait of Hormuz has flattened back down to levels not seen since before this conflict began, after a brief uptick in June that turned out to be a false signal of normalization. Understand what these numbers actually represent in aggregate. Every single one of these cost increases eventually gets passed down the supply chain, landing on the price of fuel, the price of goods that require oil-based transportation or plastics, and the broader cost of living in economies that depend on stable, affordable energy imports. This isn't an abstract geopolitical story happening far away from your daily life. It's already showing up in the cost structure of global trade, whether or not the headlines connecting these three conflicts have reached you yet. Let's also talk about the human cost running through all three of these fronts, because it's easy to focus purely on cargo, insurance premiums, and geopolitics, while losing sight of the people actually operating these vessels. Seafarers are reportedly pulling back from Black Sea trade routes because crew members are being killed in these attacks. We don't have precise casualty numbers, because no official body has released clean figures on how many mariners have been killed or wounded throughout this entire campaign. What visibility we do have largely comes from footage circulating on social platforms, and it paints a picture of civilian crews absorbing real casualties in conflicts they have no say in choosing to participate in. That same dynamic is playing out to varying degrees across all three of these regions. Real people doing a job that keeps global trade functioning, increasingly caught in the crossfire of conflicts that have nothing to do with their own nationality or their employer's flag. Now here's a timing element that makes the Black Sea situation specifically more urgent than people realize. Ukraine is heading into harvest season, and wheat, sunflower seed, and other grain exports need to move out of the country in the coming weeks to reach world markets. Some of that cargo moves via the Danube River, but the Danube is currently running at extremely low water levels due to a severe heat wave across Europe this summer, forcing vessels to load lighter and requiring more trips to move the same total volume. That makes the Black Sea route more essential for Ukraine's economy at the exact moment it's become measurably more dangerous. Meanwhile, Russia had scaled back its own Black Sea oil, pumping for a period, and is now back up and running, which raises the question of whether Ukraine's prior pattern of targeting Russian oil infrastructure resumes as a response. Let's talk about what China's specific behavior tells us about how seriously major global powers are actually taking this convergence. Because I think this is one of the more underappreciated signals in the entire situation. Governments issue diplomatic statements constantly, and those statements are often calibrated for political effect rather than genuine internal risk assessment. But when a state-linked shipping company like Costco or China Merchants makes the costly decision to withdraw an entire category of vessels from a profitable trading region, that decision reflects real risk modeling, not diplomatic messaging. In my opinion, China's withdrawal from the Middle East is a more honest indicator of how seriously this situation is developing than almost anything said publicly by any government involved. Now, I want to give you the honest counterbalance here too, because I always want to leave you with the full picture, not just the alarming part. Roughly 80% of world cargo is still moving without major disruption right now. Ports are full. Goods are moving. Shipping, as an industry, has proven remarkably resilient throughout this entire multi-front crisis. It behaves like water finding cracks in a sidewalk, rerouting, absorbing cost, and continuing to function even under significant pressure. That resilience is real, and it's worth remembering before anyone assumes global trade is on the verge of total collapse. It isn't, at least not yet. But resilience isn't the same thing as safety, and constant adaptation isn't free. Every reroute, every dark transit, every ship-to-ship transfer, every fleet withdrawal adds cost, and that cost compounds when it's happening across 3 major maritime regions simultaneously rather than in just one contained area. Global trade growth slows under that kind of sustained pressure, and that slowdown eventually touches consumer prices and economic growth well beyond the shipping industry itself. Here's my honest verdict on all of this, and I want to be clear, this is my opinion, based on years spent tracking vessel behavior and maritime conflict patterns. What we are watching right now across the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and the Black Sea, including its extension into the Caspian, is not 3 separate regional conflicts that happen to be occurring at the same time. It is the early formation of a single, interconnected threat to freedom of the seas, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. The same 4-part pattern of insurance spikes, dark transits, workaround logistics, and reduced open transparency is repeating across every single front, involving completely different belligerents. And that repetition tells you the underlying vulnerability being exploited is structural, not incidental. Freedom of the seas has never been something that maintains itself automatically. It has to be actively defended and paid for. And right now, across 3 fronts simultaneously, that defense is being tested in a way that should concern anyone who depends on global trade functioning normally, which, in practice, is basically everyone. So here's the question I want to leave you with. 2. Given that these 3 separate conflicts are now visibly overlapping through shared tactics, shared supply routes, and now even shared strikes connecting one theater to another, do you think the international community bears more responsibility for failing to defend freedom of the seas collectively? Or do you think this is simply the natural consequence of individual nations pursuing their own separate wars without regard for the broader shipping system they're all damaging together? Let me know where you land on that, and let's get a real debate going in the comments. If you got value out of this breakdown, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next update. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to see how these 3 conflicts are actually connecting. And if you want to support the channel directly, hit that super thanks button below or head over to Patreon. Until the next episode.